is take one, and let me see what day it is. Okay, this is countdown 3, 2, 1. I'm Gamariyahu Ben Yehuda, your spiritual investigator, your tour guide throughout things of interest to people who are seeking truth. Right now, as you can see, we're in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States of America. Today's date happens to be August 24th. And at the same time that we're standing here, there are several thousands of people who have assembled themselves in the nation's capital again to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. The March on Washington was perhaps most notably remembered for the speech that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave, which has come to be known as the I Have a Dream speech. However, when we go back and we remember the text of what Dr. King said, we also remember that he spoke of a check, a check that had been written to the descendants of Africans in this country that had not been filled. So the March on Washington was actually a march protesting in pursuit of equality, jobs, housing, things along this line. Freedom, justice, and equality was the cry, or actually that's 3 cries. So as we think about these things, and before we actually bring to you a particular commentary about all of these events, we have to go back and remember that this city, which has more than enough beauty and splendor and things to see, was initially assisted in being planned by one gentleman of African descent by the name of Benjamin Banneker. So he's a genius, a astronomer, and as well an architect. These are just some of his many accomplishments and great accolades to his credit. So we want to recognize our brother, our forefather, Benjamin Banneker. Now, back to the March on Washington. Approximately 50 years ago, in the speech that Dr. King gave, he talked about a check that had been made to the sons and daughters of slaves, that they would be able to find freedom, justice, and equality. And in the speech, he also made the statement that that check bounced, that the check did in fact come back labeled insufficient funds. So we're using this window of time, this 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, to focus on the state of affairs for people of African descent living in the United States, whether they call themselves African American or what have you. What is the state of affairs as it pertains to this particular group of people? And we want to focus on those areas. Let's talk about freedom, justice, and equality. So in terms of that, as far as justice is concerned, it is no secret that at this time today that the African in America has a peculiar station before the courts. The Trayvon Martin affair, this is something that is very much on the lips of and is very much a concern for people of African descent in the United States. However, when we consider the fact that Zimmerman, he was able to walk out of the courtroom scot-free, and there's another sister in another part of these United States who is who happens to be African American, who is incarcerated because she actually in self-defense ended up slaying her ex-boyfriend, as I'm understanding it, who had a history of actually beating her. So these are peculiar events when you weigh them in terms of the scales of justice in America. Now, freedom, justice, and equality. Well, when we look up 50 years later, we would be hard-pressed, you would be hard-pressed with a basic understanding of the situation as it applies to African Americans. You'd be hard-pressed to say that en masse that they have overcome. This is 50 years later. It's very significant because in 1963, when the speech was given, we recall the events 5 years later when Dr. King was assassinated. This very same city, Washington, D.C., went up in flames. So we're looking now for freedom, justice, and equality. Well, we're not, but some of the people in these United States are. And unfortunately, the check is still bouncing. It's 50 years bouncing up until this day and time, because as a group, as a body, as a demographic segment of the population, African Americans still lag disproportionately in the areas of housing, in the areas of justice before the law, in the areas of economics, you name it. In fact, we go so far as to say that they made a bad deal, and if they're continuing to wait on that particular check to be paid in full in these United States, I think maybe 50 years later they'll be saying the exact same things at that time. So, in closing, you have the Capitol building behind us, which is where the laws of these United States are made. And we have to recall that when we talk about freedom, justice, and equality for the African American, as he has been identified, that the laws pertaining to this nation are made right in that building behind me. And so we recall that the law of the land at one time in this country was slavery. Slavery was legal. Chattel slavery was legal. And that would have made it a criminal offense to impede the ownership or violate the ownership of property by a slave master. We recall that in this building behind me, that the 3/5 of a man doctrine, which was used to help determine the voting, what do you call it? Not a voting recipe, but the voting formula by which they would determine who would be recognized as a citizen. So what happened was they figured out this formula because there were so many transported. That's another point that I have to make right now. This term slave, we have to be very careful about using that term of slave. The people who came over here on those boats, they were not slaves, okay? They were not sitting in Africa as slaves waiting to be transported here to be slaves in America. These men were, they were architects. These men were farmers. These men were doctors. These women, you know, everything that was needed to create and build a sustainable society, they were. As opposed to referring to the sons and daughters of Africa who got caught up in the slave trade as slaves, we must always, from this point in time forth that you're hearing these words come from my mouth, refer to them as prisoners of war. Yes, prisoners of war, but that's what they were. So, it's the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and we're very much concerned about these events and hoping that our people will in fact see that if they are to actually secure any of those things, that they will have to do these things for themselves. And they should perhaps begin to turn their eyes within their own communities, but also within their communities back home in Africa, so that the connection can once again be remade. So I admonish all of us, all of those who might have the opportunity to see this video and hear my words, that do for self. We must do for self. And we can't look to anyone outside of ourselves to provide the answers, to provide the solutions that we so desperately need. Signing off here in the capital of the United States of America, this is your brother, Gamari Yahu Ben Yehuda.